William Marshal needs no introduction. He's the most famous knight in history. He served 4 kings, 5 if you include Henry the Young King. So, without further ado, let's get stuck in. It is the year of our Lord, 1215. The Magna Carta has been signed, but quickly annulled by the Pope, leading to further unrest with the nobility, now led by Robert Fitzwater and his so-called Army of God. So, while the Marshal heads off to fight a Welsh uprising, King John has opened his war against his barons, and, having won the siege at Rochester Castle in the autumn, now begins to harry the kingdom. These are brutal times indeed. No one was safe, as it is written that the king's men rampaged with swords drawn and knives on open display. They ransacked towns, villages, graveyards and churches, robbing all and sundry. Neither woman nor child was spared, and it was said his armies were like the limbs of the devil, akin to a plague of locusts covering the earth. And such wanton savagery had not been seen since the anarchy of King Stephen. These were awful times. John was a king gone mad, his paranoia finally consuming him. As the autumn became winter, there was no end in sight to the murder, the savagery. All this has driven some of the rebel barons to look for France for a new king. The young and dashing Louis the Lion, France's heir apparent, the son of King Philippe Augustus. Thus, the Earl of Winchester, Sir de Quincy, is sent to France to invite France's Lion to take the crown for himself. And this is no trick, but a desperate, last-ditch attempt by barons pushed to the brink. And let's give this a proper look, because Prince Louis of France does have a claim to the English crown, should John be overthrown, because Louis is married to Blanche of Castile, who is the granddaughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine and King Henry II. Yes, it's a pretty weak link, but who else is there? King John's only 2 sons are mere children. Henry is only around 8, and Richard is only around 6. And let's face it, the women will be overlooked. The youngest, Joan, is only around 4 or 5, and the youngest of the daughters is only a few months old. So, in context, Louis the Lion's claim is looking pretty solid. And this is a move that could pretty much create an empire that spanned all the way from the north of Scotland to southern France, going by the vassals of Philippe Augustus. Only this new empire would be Capetian rather than Angevin. Not that anyone was complaining, as the nobles could claim land again on the continent. After all, they had more in common with Frankish customs than Saxon customs. Many still didn't speak English. The opportunity was in France's hands. All Louis had to do was take it. And he absolutely accepted the offer, declaring that he'd raise an army and invade in the spring of 1216. But the Lion of France was no stranger to strategy, and when 1215 passed the torch to 1216, Louis sent a body of troops over the Channel to London as a recon detachment to take a look at the English, see what they were up to. This advanced guard arrived in January 1216, to the joy of the population there in London, who saw them as a light that would banish the dark clouds of tyranny, according to Gerald of Wales at least. But this isn't about Louis, this is about William Marshal, and he, being the king's right-hand man, had a different view on things. He's not as enthusiastic about Louis as the Londoners are, and the other rebel barons. No. His histories call all this lark with Louis as utter foolishness. The author explains that upon arriving in London, the French spent all their time drinking many a barrel and cask of wine, rather than reconnaissance in preparation for war. Basically, getting completely Brahms and Liszt, if you get my drift. But King John took the threat very seriously indeed, so in response he teamed up William Marshal with the controversial fighting Bishop of Winchester, Peter de Roche, and sent them as ambassadors all the way to Paris to hopefully negotiate a deal with King Philippe Augustus. Basically, remind the French king that there is still a 5-year truce in play. This should not be broken under any circumstances. Plus, get Philippe to have a word with his son. Call the invasion off. But no, Philippe was 100% behind his son. There was no backing out. The die was cast. Even the intervention of a papal legate, Guala Bicchieri, changes very little. Now, some explanation is needed here, as Cardinal Bicchieri isn't here by accident. Right, he's sent by Pope Innocent III to prevent war breaking out again between England and France. And yes, Innocent III is still Pope, as sure, he's been the Pope for around 18 years, but he's only in his 50s. He became Pope in his mid to late 30s. He's still rather young, and has many years left in him. And you'll never guess what. Pope Innocent III has yet another crusade in mind, a 5th crusade, to make up for the disaster back in 1204, when Constantinople was sacked by the Crusaders. Naturally, Innocent wants these negotiations to go well. So right now, Guala Bicchieri has arrived in Paris to mediate between the two warring factions, England and France. Guala naturally supports John, as he is a friend of the Pope, and it is made clear that this invasion is not good in the eyes of the papacy. Louis would be an enemy of the Church. But the French, they're not listening. They are invoking the name of Duke Arthur. So the invasion is still on. Peter de Roche and William Marshal are thus banished from Paris and sent back to England. But Cardinal Bicchieri is also on orders to head back to England, as this Barons' War isn't good for the Crusade either, so he heads back with them. While the Marshal was away, King John was busy mustering forces to fight this French invasion, which occurs on the 22nd of May, 1216, as despite papal threats, Louis the Lion decides to invade anyway, sailing over the Channel with a vast army, landing in Kent, supported by the rebels, which I will add include William Marshal's eldest son, younger William, who we've been calling William Jr. It is 1066 all over again, with John playing Harold, and no doubt hoping there'd be a different outcome. And just like Harold, King John absolutely wants to meet Louis in the field of battle. But with the Marshal back in England, he talks the king out of it. The crown cannot be risked in a pitched battle. That would be reckless, especially when John's mercenaries haven't been paid in a while. They could switch sides at any moment. Plus, John had underestimated Louis at Rochemont. Louis was not a weak opponent, far from it. A pitched battle would be folly. So it is obvious that John is in a predicament, and he is advised to secure his legacy if all else fails. Thus the king places his eldest son, the now 9-year-old Henry, under the closest of guards, at Devizes Castle in Wiltshire, along with Queen Isabella of Angoulême. This done, King John then retreats to Corfe Castle to consolidate his thoughts, to think this through, no doubt treating it like the game of chess he was fond of, stepping away from the table, rethinking his strategy. But once John retreated, Louis springs into action. All of a sudden, his army is on the move. Taking most of Kent, including Canterbury, he marches west, taking Winchester without effort. He's already taken London. Louis the Lion now holds not only both of England's historical capitals, but the seat of the church, Canterbury. The Counts of Arundel abandon John. York joins the French. Even Surrey, men previously loyal to the last, now supporting Louis. The biggest sting would have come from the king's own half-brother, William Longsby, the hero of the Dam. He now sides with France. But he has good reason, as while he fought at Bouvines, John ran, and rumours abound that, while Longsby was waiting to be ransomed, John was having his wicked way with his wife Ella. Consensual or not, we don't know. We may never know the truth. And to top it all off, Pope Innocent III passes away suddenly in July. He's only in his mid-50s. So much for life ahead of him. A bad omen indeed. It is looking bleak for John. Right now, it all rests on Dover, which quickly finds itself under siege by Louis's forces. Now, remember Hubert de Burgh? He was the man who was once placed in charge of Arthur of Brittany all those years ago. De Burgh is the man now defending Dover Castle against these impossible odds. In any normal circumstances, doom is certain, but he manages to hold out. With sheer stubborn resolve, de Burgh simply refuses to capitulate, refuses to surrender. He holds out. He is stalling the French. And he's not the only bugger not playing ball. There is also Windsor Castle. The defenders there are also under siege. They're also being a right pain in the bum for both the rebels and the French. There is also another glimmer of hope. The formidable fortress at Lincoln Castle. Unfortunately, the Castellan there, Gerald de Cranville, had passed away the previous year, leaving his widow in charge of things, the elderly Lady Nicola de la Haye. So King John races up to Lincoln to rally the support of the Castellan there. Only as he approaches, he is met by the elderly Nicola de la Haye, who rides out to greet him. There Nicola hands the king the keys to the castle, claiming that she is simply too old and cannot do her duty in office any longer. But John, the silver-tongued devil, manages to convince Nicola to remain in office that little bit longer, assume the role of Castellan, because the rebels, along with the French, are on their way, and Lincoln Castle cannot fall. By the summer, John's support was evaporating in the north and east of England. More and more were flocking to the rebel banner, allying with the French, around 2/3 of the nobility. But as for the Marshal, he's once again found stationed in Wales, working with Ranulph de Blondeville in protecting the border. Despite all the previous arguments with the king, the Marshal is proving his loyalty to the last. In spite of all the odds, as let's face it, the war is not looking good. And it wasn't like there was no way out, politically for the seasoned veteran, as the Knights Templar had already given him a lifeline during the spring of that year, 1216. Amory of St. Maur, the Master Templar, was acting as a mediator between William Marshal and his son, William Jr. Basically, if old Willie would turn to the dark side,
my son,
there'd be a space open for him. Amory is trying to arrange a meeting between the two men, father and son, and it is frustrating that no records survive of this. It would be fascinating to know what was said leading to this. But the Marshal still refuses to switch sides. He stays loyal to his king regardless. And I will say that the Marshal isn't spending all his time in Striguil or Pembroke. He's often residing at the castle in Gloucester, which, by the way, has its own politics. You see, King John was previously married to Isabella of Gloucester. These are her lands by birthright. She was only allowed them back through her new husband, Geoffrey de Mandeville. But the old boy died early this year, so everything again is in a flux. And as you can guess, John is hogging her lands, which will soon be given to Hubert de Burgh, but that is another story. Then in October, while the Marshal is residing in Gloucester, he's there with the papal legate, as Cardinal Bicchieri. The worst of news comes in from the north. The king had fallen gravely ill. The king who'd been racing around his kingdom in perpetual motion, tackling the rebellion head on. He had driven himself to exhaustion, and possibly overindulged on peaches and cider. And that's hard cider to those in the States. No mucking about with old John, only the best for the king's table. But alas, jokes aside, King John was suffering from dysentery, but even then he's not giving up. His entourage is still on the move. There's even an invasion from Scotland as King Alexander now sides with Louis. The war is a stalemate, but the king is determined to break it. So John doesn't quit. He cannot quit. Always on the move. At some point, while travelling through the estuary called the Wash, he'll lose the crown jewels in the murky waters, but that was the least of his worries. His dysentery was getting worse, and it looked as though the king would not recover. The royal entourage makes its final stop at Newark Castle. The king can travel no more. And on his deathbed, he would confess his sins. That's a weekend in itself. But anyway, he also hoped to God that the Marshal would forgive him for all the wrongs he'd done to the great man. John also wished for his 9-year-old son, Henry, to be placed under the care of the Marshal. A last final order of duty from a failing king. And then, on October the 18th, the king was no more. And, like always, his critics had the last word. Foul as it is, hell itself is made fouler by the presence of John. Whew, everyone's a critic. From Gloucester, William Marshal rides like the wind northwards to Worcester. With him is the papal legate, Guale Bicchieri. There, the fallen king was being prepared for his funeral, to be laid in state at the cathedral. It was to be an opulent affair that gave John some dignity, even if the future of the kingdom was uncertain. The Marshal even sent his nephew John to collect silks for the funeral, and soon the infamous monarch was laid to rest. Once this was done, it was time to look at the bigger picture, as the kingdom was in a state of chaos. Most of it had been taken by the rebels and their French allies. Louis had captured so much. London had fallen, as had Winchester, Canterbury. There was a wind of change coming, and the next decision would make or break a man like the Marshal. Repercussions that would affect his family for years to come. The line of France could be crowned right there and then, in London. This was the easy route. But there was also John's eldest son, Henry, a boy of just 9 years old. He could also be crowned king, but it would be a struggle, as the treasury was empty and he would be a penniless king. Henry also had very little support. But the Marshal had his duty to protect the boy. He was about to fulfil that vow, so So if anyone thought for a second that the Marshal was going to switch sides to Louis, they were gravely mistaken. So even though the Marshal wouldn't have been aware of the king's dying wish until he reached Worcester, he still immediately took it upon himself to protect the heir apparent to the English throne, the future Henry III. There was no time to waste. The boy had to be crowned. But where? London had fallen to the French, as had Winchester. Canterbury wasn't in any position to support the Marshal either, who along with Cardinal Bicchieri was the one organising this rallying cry to support Henry. It was a last-ditch attempt at hope by any means. But until the crown was placed on the king's head, he was but a man, so the race was on. So where to crown the new king? It was decided upon the Abbey at Gloucester. That would be the location of the coronation that would secure the English crown. Now, all they needed was the boy. So William Marshal sets out with an army, heading for Gloucester, securing the town. He then sends an armed force south to collect the young boy and his mother. And in all honesty, the Marshal could have handled this situation a bit better. Right, we all know the situation. Things are tense. So, from the perspective of Queen Isabella of Angoulême, who is currently hidden away in Devizes Castle with young Henry, it is unknown if Louis had taken the crown or not. And now a body of armed troops have arrived to collect her and her son. For all she knows, the rebels have arrived to put them to death. Especially as one of the men supposedly escorting her entourage is the controversial fighting bishop Peter de Roche, a Frenchman, and Ralph de St. Sampson. All her courage rests in the hand of Thomas of Stamford, who takes charge of things. Are they put to death? No. Instead, they are taken northwards to Gloucester, most likely still uncertain of their fate, and even if they were told, which no doubt they were, so much lies and deceit were about in these troubled times. Also, young Henry was so small he had to be carried by one of the knights as they continued their journey. But the Marshal himself has ridden out to greet them halfway. At Malmesbury, the two groups meet on a road surrounded by the open countryside. Then, upon seeing the famous knight, who is around 70 at this point, tensions break. There is much emotion. The young boy bursts into tears, but not of sadness, but of joy. And there, before the Marshal, young Henry is said to have pledged to put himself in the service of the Marshal. By now, tears are in everybody's eyes. Even the usually stoic Marshal was said to have a broken character and shed tears of his own. A new dawn had begun. With the weight of the Marshal behind Henry, the ball can start rolling. But even with a coronation, the kingdom would still have to be won by force, as Louis would no doubt fight, as will the rebels. But there was one huge advantage on the side of the Marshal, and that was the papal legate Guardi Bicchieri, as he came with a lot of clout. It also meant that the coronation had papal support, something Louis lacked. And people who had previously turned their back on John now willingly threw their support behind his son Henry. Men like the Marshal's son, William Jr., again for lack of a better term, and the Earl of Salisbury, William Longsby. These, and barons like them, were dubbed the Reversi, the Returners, because they're once again flying the King's banner. Though he'd not been crowned just yet, but a date was set. Just 10 days after the death of King John, the coronation of Henry III was hurriedly put into place on the 28th of October, 1216. The only real problem now was that one of the senior barons, the Earl of Chester, Ranulph de Blondeville, wasn't present at Gloucester. They're all arguing about it, but with or without him, the show must go on. Time was of the essence. But of course you cannot crown just any Tom, Dick and Harry. To become a king, you first must become a knight, as king was knight first and foremost. Thus, it came to the Marshal to give the young scallywag the last blow he'll ever receive without retaliation, before handing him the sword and belt of knighthood. Henry had knelt a boy and rose a knight. As for the coronation itself, this was performed by the highest-ranking bishop present, who just happened to be a Peter de Roche, a bishop of Winchester, supported in his role by Guadalbicieri and the Bishop of Bath, a Jocelyn of Wells. Jocelyn also administered the royal oath, the new king reciting after him word for word. But first, the young boy had to be led down the nave and through the rood screen to the high altar beyond the choir. Imagine it, you're 9 years old, your father just died, you don't know the fate of the kingdom, everything's in turmoil, and you're led up through these areas, just with a handful of people. Oh, the joys of old footage. But it must have been intimidating for the young boy, who now reaches the high altar and undergoes the ceremony. Jocelyn of Wells is administering the royal oath, and Henry is repeating it back, whether he understood it or not. The young king announces in a high voice that he would maintain peace, honour and reverence of God. He vows all the promises of the king's duty, do justice to his people, observe good laws and customs, and abolish all the bad and evil ones. But then Henry goes off script, and no doubt prompted by others who gave him another script. He now promises to pay homage to the papacy for England and Ireland, swearing to pay the Irish the 700 marks in tribute that John had one day promised them, along with the 1,000 marks tithe to Rome. This is a lot of money and will come into its own issues further down the line. But right now, it is time to place the crown on his head. But alas, his father, King John, lost the crown jewels in the wash. So instead, they use a woman's circlet, hastily supplied by his mother, Isabella of Angoulême. It was the most royal object they had. This innocent boy of destiny. But naturally, all of this was followed by something far more important. The obligatory feast. But even so, it wasn't all fun and games, as they'd only fired the starting gun. They've yet to win the race. Once the feast was over, the Marshal retired to his chambers to contemplate the situation that now lay ahead. It looked bleak. That was for certain. Some had most probably expected him to take power for himself, seeing as everybody else was at it. But no, he had remained loyal to the last, now serving under another king. He decides to ask advice of his Menier as what to do next. And the Marshal's histories tell us of an argument that went on between his loyal knights that evening, sparked when a joyous John Marshal made a remark about how glad his uncle would be to lead the armies of this new king. What a great honour, the glory, and the coin that came with it. But John of Early is against all of this, suggesting that the Marshal is an old man, his body is in decline, and war would break him. We cannot take these words as gospel, whatever was said. These two arguments are merely highlights in old pages. They are telling us, the audience, of where we are in Marshal's story, in his life. As sure, the Marshal is this legendary figure, the hero of many a joust, a king's man, who was served under 5 crowns, given that Henry the young king had a coronation. He is the veteran of 5 decades of war. Odysseus was but a pup. If William Marshal was to list his honours, and even if we took out the more fanciful boasts and the exaggerations, we would still have an extensive list, so we can see his nephew's point. Come out of retirement, lead the king's army once again, imagine the renown and the glory. But the boy who had served him as a mere squire, who has now grown into a powerful knight in his own right, John of Early, he is the one hitting us with facts. Simply put, the Marshal is too old. He's 70 years of age. I mean, sure, we could believe it if he was 50, 60, but not 70. And we don't know the Marshal's health, his injuries. If he had aches and pains, he would be too proud to tell anyone, and the author of his histories would be too honourable to include them. This is the 13th century, and the Marshal is a 12th century knight. There was no warts and all. He stood tall, he stood proud, and silence replaced any complaints of injuries or ill health. But anyone in their 60s would be feeling it right now, even without 50 years of military campaigns. Just getting up in the morning is bad enough. So we naturally side with John of Early. The Marshal needs to remain in retirement. But chance would be a fine thing, and it is clear that God had other ideas. As war loomed on the horizon, and all eyes were on the Marshal.